Originally this review was meant to follow up the Shenmue 2 review. Coming off that video I was actually getting short on games to review. Don't get me wrong, there were and are many games where I still want to sing their praises, but all of the pre-existing footage I had at the time was either in 720p or had been murdered by YouTube's compression. Of course, the day after that review went live, all videos following it were in 1440p just to make sure the same thing didn't happen. It means that any future footage I uploaded would be in good quality to reuse for reviews, and it'd make them look nice for general viewing. Something about higher quality videos get compressed better on YouTube, I don't know the full details. Now, with all of that said and done, I didn't have many options. I could have reviewed Sonic 06 or Generations due to them already being in 1440p, but I feel like I'd be rehashing a lot of ground I'd already covered. Again, I want these reviews to feel like something not many people have said before, so with my options limited and the next review not being due for a few months, I wanted to try to review another Sonic game. I mean, that's what started this series, and at the time it was coming up on the year anniversary of the first review, so I figured I'd have a crack at it. The only downside is that upon writing the majority of this script, I changed course at the last minute to make the Sonic Adventure 2 review for that game's 20th anniversary, meaning this one was just kind of left here for half a year. But we've finally gotten around to it again. We're playing Sonic Lost World. Now, to my surprise, people really hate this game. I genuinely went into this thinking I'd be treading a little bit of ground people already had before, but it turns out the common consensus is that this game is just something that should be blasted off the earth for simply existing. It's awful, no redeeming features, a run button in a Sonic game? Ludicrous. If it isn't obvious, I don't agree with that. I think Lost World, while not perfect by any means, still has a lot of good things going for it, as hopefully you're soon to find out. Now, I know I've probably bitten off a little bit more than I can chew with this review, so if you could help leave a like and fend off the incoming horde of haters this game has, that'd be grand. And with all that said, we're in for one hell of a ride. Developed by Sonic Team and released for the Wii U in 2013 before later being ported to PC, Sonic Lost World is what followed up Sonic Generations in the Sonic franchise. Ditching the boost gameplay from the last three entries, Lost World introduced parkour, a run button, and kept wisps from Sonic colours. For this video I'm only going to focus on the Wii U version. I know that is a 3DS version, I've just never played it. Either way, it received a middle of the road to downright negative reviews and was criticised for feeling like a rip-off Mario Galaxy among other things. Was the hate deserved, or is there something underrated here that people just weren't able to find 8 years ago? I don't know. I got a ways into the game and never ended up finishing it. But with that said, let's have a merry little trip down memory lane to see if Sonic Lost World really is the game most people make it out to be, or if there's more to it than that. Now, if you want to hear something funny, the biggest problem a lot of people have with this game is the writing. Now, look, I've learnt my lesson from the Shenmue 2 review, okay? We're going to keep this part concise. You don't exactly need to know every little in and out event, you just need to know whether the story is good or not with some key moments here and there. But first and foremost, Lost World's story is flawed, and I don't think anyone is trying to argue otherwise. The short version is that Sonic and Tails are chasing Eggman in the tornado after he steals some Flickies. He drops them and hits the plane they're in, causing them to crash land. This place floating in the sky is called the Lost Hex. These guys called the Zeti live here and they work for Eggman. Eggman wants to build a machine to suck the life out of the world below to power something, for world domination probably. And the only thing stopping the Zeti from Control-Alt-Deleting Eggman out of existence is this shell thing, and it's gone. So the Zeti are their own bosses now, and they've got pretty much everything of Eggman's at their disposal. After that, it's a matter of teaming up with Eggman and heading to the machine to turn it off so the world doesn't end. Not much else happens after that mark, it's slow sailing, with most cutscenes being introductions to each of the Zeti or some light comedy. That is until you reach the last two zones, in which Tails is seemingly kidnapped and turned into a cyborg, Eggman seemingly falls off a bridge and dies, Amy and Knuckles flat out die due to the effects the machine is having on the world below. It gets pretty dark. Now, all of that turns out not to be the case. Eventually the Zeti are defeated, Tails manages to stop himself getting converted, Eggman is alive, cue final boss, and the life is restored back to the world, reviving everyone else. Now it goes from A to B, but it suffers from some serious problems, the main one being that the writers can't decide what tone they want to go with. Now for most of the game, things are relatively happy-go-lucky, but occasionally there will be these really dark, out-of-place scenes that serve no real purpose for the plot. If you want an example, at some point Tails gets mad at Sonic for trusting Eggman more than him, which normally you'd think would be reasonable after all they're good friends. But in this instance, it's Eggman's machine and Eggman's mechs they're fighting against. If anyone knows how to stop them, it's going to be him. None of that ends up mattering though, because it never gets followed up on. Eggman also has a cutscene which has a few choice words. Peggy 7 game, by the way. There's another one that I mentioned before where Amy radios in from time to time and eventually dies. And of course there's the I was too slow to save my buddy scene is here too, and it's not good when any of these scenes are on. I think we'll get into voice acting later, but I think this cast are just better when they're keeping it light. And quite honestly, I don't understand why they just didn't keep the tone light. When the tone is light, I would argue that the game's writing is actually pretty good. I'm not sure if there was some sort of mandate that they had to write the game in a certain way, but really, if they kept the tone light, it wouldn't be my favourite Sonic story, but it'd be one that I can at least enjoy going back to from time to time. And as it stands right now, I enjoy going back to certain scenes from time to time. It's just a shame that there are some scenes which make me want to scoop out my eyeballs because they're that bad. To add even more insult to injury, things really just never end up getting resolved. Like, yeah, they go from A to B, but I think resolving some of the on-the-left plot threads would have been pretty helpful. Tails getting annoyed at the dumbest things, there's not really an explanation for that, they just needed some drama. You never really understand what the Lost Hex of the Zeti are, just that there's something there to facilitate the plot, and how even Eggman met the Zeti. It throws you straight into the action and isn't afraid to cut a few corners here and there to keep the duration short. And it shows. Which is a shame, because as I've said, anything that isn't one of those overtly dark scenes I actually enjoy. When the game isn't trying to be an edge fest, it's a decent time through and through. The Zeti, while being one-dimensional, do have some really good jokes, though a few do fall flat. And when he's not being angsty for no reason, Tails, Sonic, Eggman along with Orbot and Cubot can actually have some decent chemistry. For as much as I'll rag on the story for being inconsistent, when it's good and the tone is light, it's good. It's light-hearted, and I full well believe that that was the intention, and I can enjoy myself with it at times, even if that might end up being balanced out with more than enough cringe parts too. I think the biggest complaint most people have here is characterization, and yeah, I can see the cracks at point, but I don't think it's as bad as something like Forces was. I'll be the first to say that Tails goes on a little bit too much about how smart he is, and Sonic is just a straight prick in some scenes. And yeah, fair point. On the other hand, I've heard people say that the Zeti were one-dimensional, and that's true, but I honestly don't see that as too much of a bad thing. Also, I think keeping them simple is definitely a bonus here. Not every character needs to have some sort of internal moral dilemma. Just let some guys be evil for the sake of evil, damn it. Could you imagine trying to flesh these guys out in the runtime they had? Like, yikes. Like, it's a Wii U game, I think the word budget was definitely used lightly during development, and so while I think giving cutscenes more room to breathe would have been nice, I can at least cut them a little bit of a slack. Again, I think these guys being one though actually allows some pretty good jokes here and there, since you don't really need any setup to understand them. Zomom just wants to eat Sonic, his whole trait is being hungry. Xena hates Sonic for ruining her nails, her whole thing is vanity and appearances, and Zaz just wants to fight anything that moves. Does keeping them simple make it easy for kids to follow along and kind of show where the demographic was? Yes. Is that a bad thing in this case? No. Well, then there's Zavok. Look, everything else about the story would be fine if not for this red fucker. All the other Zeti are pretty chill for the most part, and then Mr. Aggressive over here decides to bring the Happy Moon down 10 octaves. He's still one-dimensional like all of the others, he's the strongest, and he hates anything this isn't a Zeti. Like, I understand the need for someone to call the shots after Eggman can't, and he probably did need to be a little bit aggressive to actually make him appear as a threat and a leader, but boy did they overdo it. Seriously, just pick a tone, man! A game that looks like this, and as much as I hate to say it, but this Mario-y can't be taken seriously, and I think they just should have ran with a much lighter plot for the duration. Zavok just shows up at points and has random threats of violence and taunts Sonic about how everyone he knows and loves is dead and he's gonna kill him last. He's just plain bad, and this is easily where a lot of the tonal problems actually end up stemming from. Again, it's strange since there's parts that I actually like about this game's writing and there's parts I dislike. Although I've got to say, the good just barely outweighs the bad. This apparently was the first game Pontac and Graf, the localization writers for Cores and Generations, were allowed to come up with the premise for, and they definitely seem to be more in their element here than in the games before it. It could definitely be worked on, but I think the story here is alright. Substandard in parts for sure, but for the majority, the experience is actually somewhat entertaining if nothing else. It reminds me of an old Saturday morning cartoon that can be extremely rough around the edges at times. But I think it's important to note that I also like the majority of Sonic X, so feel free to take that opinion with a grain of salt. The story gets a meh ranking, the good scenes are good, not great, and if it was just those types of scenes it'd probably bump my score up a little bit. But I can't in good conscience give this a good rating when there's just so many cutscenes that are plain awful. Although, like I said, this is just the story. I'm not going to let it affect the rest of my opinion on the game all that much, since if you're playing a Sonic game for a story, I'm sorry, but you're clearly playing the game wrong. But then, as if to apologise for the flaws in the writing, the graphics and audio show up. First and foremost, this game looks bloody gorgeous, and while a step back from something like Unleashed or Generations, it's a severe improvement over Colorants and Forces. It's not exactly trying to be super realistic in its effects. I think it knows the style it wants to go with, and it sticks with it. The only shortcoming I can really think of is that in the dark levels, I feel as though there's a missed opportunity for some of the stuff they could have done with lighting. They also use bland looking settings for way too many of the cutscenes. A little variety would have been nice and spicy. But for the rest of the game, I really have no complaints. I absolutely dig this aesthetic. I think it's hard to deny it does look a little bit like a Mario game at times too. And that's not a bad thing. For what it's worth, the game has a stable frame rate for the entire time on the Wii U and PC, and when you consider the track record this series has in trying to balance graphics and performance, Lost World is a nice, appreciated change of pace. You know what else the game doesn't get enough credit for? The camera. You can't control it here, and while that might sound bad, you really don't need to. You aren't exploring for collectibles, and if you are, they're hidden in plain enough sight. It sounds strange to say this, but you don't actually need camera controls to beat the game comfortably, because dare I say that Sonic Team actually made a good automated camera for this game. 2D sections are as you'd expect, but I think the choice to have the 3D camera simply behind Sonic at all times, keeping a fair distance, really helps. In other games this wouldn't work, sure, but with the way the game was kind of designed, it seems that almost all levels were made with this limitation in mind. And honestly, not having to worry about moving the camera and letting the game fully take the reins is a brain of fresh air. And that brings us to the cutscenes. Much like every game since Sonic Adventure, there's a mix of CG and real-time cutscenes as you go through the story. And for the most part, they're all presented really well. Noticeably on PC, they seem to have a lot less pixelation than those in the Generations port, which was fucking laughable. But we'll cross that bridge after some more time. Moving on, in one department they're lacking is the animations. Don't get me wrong, they're fine, they just don't pop with attitude like you do in the other games, and on the whole they're nothing really special until you hit the CG cutscenes. Yeah, watch the opening cutscene and you can see where the animation budget went, and it kind of shows. Now, as for the character designs, the main cast are all pretty much in their Generations models, although I actually really like the designs for the Zeti. They're all distinctive enough from one another, so that even if you can't remember their names, you can certainly tell what they're about just from a glance. I mean, we have Hungry, Female, myself, the strong one Zaz, and the teacher. As for if they work as villains, I think they do. They certainly aren't any Metal Overworld or Dark Gaia, but I think you can say that these guys are villains just from their designs. I mean, in the event you even thought otherwise, they even gave them the Bowser spike bands just to drive it home. Though that really didn't help the idea that a lot of people thought this was Mario Galaxy ripoff now, did it? So I've sang the graphics praises for a while now, so imagine my disappointment when the PC version of this game really doesn't offer much in the way of longevity for them. For Generations, you can tell some effort went into making the game look as good as possible for as long as possible when it was ported to PC. But here it just very much feels like the Wii U version with the ability to change the window size. Yeah, it kind of sucks since I dig the game's aesthetic, but I can't help but notice the clearly rough edges on much more powerful hardware. The settings themselves aren't really all that either, like fellas, is it so wrong not to want things to pop in? It doesn't ruin the look per se, it's just a missed opportunity on Sega's half that wouldn't have taken too much effort at all. I think it's fair to say that Lost World's graphics are at least a little charming. There's certainly a few minor flaws in the cutscene department, but I think on the whole it's a really interesting addition to the franchise. Mainly from a stylized point of view, it's something that's pretty unique and appealing to look at on the whole. I think there is definitely a point to say in that it feels a little bit like a Mario game, but I think it has its own little Sonic-y spin to it which makes it unique enough. It may not be photorealistic, but it is fun. Now there's one thing that doesn't usually have flaws in Sonic games, and that's the soundtrack. Tomohiro Otani is back and making the soundtrack for this one, and you can tell, oh you can really tell. Every single track is an absolute joy to listen to and attempts to fit the setting of the current stage. And every single zone has at least 2 unique tracks to make sure that things are always kept fresh. Sick of the Desert Ruins music by the end of the first act, Honeycomb Highway will kick in. Juice Archipelago exists too, and that's an instant 10. Now, credit where it's due, some tracks do reuse parts of previous themes, perhaps a little bit heavily. For example, Windy Hill Act 2 is very much Windy Hill Act 1 melodically, just with a different set of instruments and tempo to keep it feeling relatively new. There's also so much variety. You have your upbeat electric guitar tracks, peaceful serene underwater rail grinding tracks, Dragon Dance absolutely jams, and Midnight Mellow, my man, oh, this thing could fit right into a Werehog level, and I'm not complaining, so if you could kindly please inject the soundtrack into my veins, I would very much appreciate it. I can't overstate how much these tracks make you want to get up and jam, and you want to know what the best thing is? The entire thing, including cutscene music, is on Spotify. Look, I know this is just the stage music, but I need to play some, if so mainly for my own sake. And then, as if there weren't enough bangers on the OST, they made boss music. Yes, anytime you fight a member of the Deadly Six, this absolute tune starts blasting, and if you're lucky, you're leaving out one of the rarer variations too. On top of that, there's music for the whole world, which helps get you a little bit excited in just the right way, music for Zavok and Eggman's boss fights respectively, and then there's the main theme. Again, I think pretty much all the music in this game sounds great, and that's pretty much par for the course in the series, but it's nice to see them keeping tradition if nothing else. Especially when they keep that tradition damn well, if I say so myself. Surprisingly enough, the game doesn't actually have a vocal theme, and I honestly think that's for the better this time around. I mean, could you imagine Crush 40 making a song for this game? Nah, I couldn't. I'll take my orchestral piece any day of the week, please and thank you. One the World is actually a nice piece for what it's worth. I think it manages to capture the tone the game is going for, at least 60% of the time, really well. It gets you ready to go out and play this mostly silly little adventure, and I like it. On that note, this game is definitely more orchestral in its music than most past games. There certainly is the odd rocking song here and there, and they're just as good as the rest of the OST, but I really think the change in instrumentation fixes this game really well. Remember when I said instrumental variety was a problem back in New Horizons? Well, you'll be glad to know that that issue has pretty much been entirely stomped with this game. There are some recurring instruments between tracks, don't get me wrong, however on the whole instrumentation is really good here. I didn't think I'd hear a banjo in a Sonic game, let alone like it, and yet here one is. It's just a shame that whenever you use a wisp, yep, they're back unfortunately, the music stops and plays a unique theme for that wisp. Think the Werehog battle theme if it happened less frequently and sounded like this. It's not exactly the most welcoming addition considering everything I just mentioned. Now before I get into a track-by-track breakdown of the OST, I want to talk about the voice acting. This game uses the 2010 Sonic cast which appeared starting at Sonic Colors, with Roger Craig Smith as Sonic and Mike Pollock returning as Eggman. And I think it goes without saying that Eggman and or/Cubot all sound as good as they ever have. Out of the entire cast, Eggman's delivery knocks the most lines and jokes out of the park, even the ones that really shouldn't land that well at all. Mini history lesson, but at Sonic Colors, the contracts that Sega had with the 4Kids voice actors expired. However, the man himself re-auditioned and got the role again, and I'm really happy that he did. As for Sonic and Tails, I think they definitely get a lot more slack than they should in this game, mostly for the writing though. I think this is one of their better performances despite that, although some things can certainly come across a little forced. I don't mind Roger's Sonic voice, I think it fits the era just fine, although it can certainly come across as a little bit too cocky at times, which makes lines like these all the more hilarious. Knuckles and Amy are also here, albeit briefly, and Knuckles sounds just fine. There really isn't much to go off in the way of delivery since he has about 10 lines for the whole game. Amy, on the other hand, it's a bit too high-pitched for my liking, and it would be grating for the fact that, again, they show up for all but 5 minutes. I think there are a lot of people who will agree with me on this, but personally I think this cast are all at their best in the Boom TV show, where the writing and direction really help sell their performances more than it does here. As for the Zesty, they all do a really good job, whether that be in cutscenes or with little quips that they'll come out within the stages, they all fit surprisingly well and deliver most of their lines flawlessly. Again, writing is a factor that I think diminished the praise that these guys got for sure, some lines just cannot be read well to save the world. But I really like their voice actors. It's just a shame that they only appear for mostly one zone and dip for the rest of the game afterwards. If it wasn't slappy levels of obvious, I think everything on the audio end of the game is honestly spectacular. A unique and varied soundtrack, voice actors doing their best, coupled together make a really nice aspect of the game. I honestly would rank this as one of Sonic's better soundtracks, like Unleashed, if but a slight bit lower. Good as this game's OST is quality-wise, the quantity that Unleashed has at the same, if not to higher quality, gives that game the edge. Again, it takes a lot to make me want to spontaneously play and review a game, but I'm very glad to say that my run-in with this game's soundtrack did exactly that. There's very little wrong here and a whole lot done right, and it's a shame that this aspect doesn't get a little bit more recognition now and then. And the good news doesn't stop there. Despite the fact that Sonic fans are seemingly always afraid of change, Sonic Lost World actually plays really well. Now, let's get something straight, this isn't a boost game and it doesn't try to be. Instead, Sonic is much slower and actually has a run button in his moveset. I've seen people criticise this change saying that a Sonic game shouldn't have a run button, but trust me when I say it's much better than how daytime Sonic controlled in platforming sections back in Unleashed, so pick your poison. The spin dash also makes a return along with a series of new parkour moves. These allow Sonic to run along and up walls, grab ledges, bounce and double jump, and while all these had their practical uses, they certainly could do with a little bit more polish. Ledge grabbing especially just feels unnecessary for how many times it actually gets used, same with the bounce. The double jump can actually make some interesting parkour in later levels, having to use one to cover distance and then the other to make it into a small space a few seconds later. While not much, it is something satisfying to do. Wall running is very much wall running. Sonic is on a wall and he can stay there for a little amount of time before he falls off, or he can jump to another wall for a little bit of an extra boost in speed to stay up there. This also by consequence leads to the wall jump to an extent, which functions about as you'd expect it to. There's also the occasional level unique mechanics which can either be a hit or a miss. For example, in Tropical Coast you roll around this big metal ball for no real specific reason, and then you follow it up with these cool puzzle segments where you need to roll fruit into a specific area in order to advance. In Frozen Factory there's a level where Sonic is a snowball the entire time, which is nice but open to its fair share of flaws. There's Honeycomb Highway, which is a level where Sonic physically can't stop running, like it's an 06 Mark Speed section, and then there's the 2 rail grinding only levels. Now let's talk about those. They can be insanely difficult, mainly because Sega thought giving players the ability to switch rails at the push of a button in a level all about grinding on rails would make it too easy. And honestly, I can see where they're coming from. The 3D sections of these levels could be cheesed if rails were handled like they have been in all the past games. No, I kid you not, you need to physically jump from rail to rail. Why not outright impossible? It can be really bloody finicky to get right, and it just feels unnecessarily difficult. Especially when the hardest part of the stage isn't even the part where you're in 3D and switching rails, it's the 2D sections. What's worse is that this is literally in the 3DS version, like, why? It just feels like an unnecessary difficulty bump that didn't really need to be there. Now, before we carry on, I feel it's important to state that the tutorials in this game aren't the best. They are not terribly invasive like the one in Unleashed, and they're not as seamlessly incorporated as they were in Unleashed HD or Heroes. Instead, you have to wait for this tutorial bubble to pop up and then tap a button to actually get the hint. Now, this is better than a dedicated tutorial section? Absolutely, it means that if you know what you're doing, you can get straight into the action with no problem and keep the pace up. I'd say some of it are positive since it leaves you to figure out the minor things like how the fruit works and whatnot. However, if you're trying to learn the controls, it's certainly less than an ideal solution considering it brings a stop to everything going on when you look at one. Crikey. Returning from past games is the new and improved, kind of, homing attack. Now this works how you'd expect. Sonic locks onto an enemy mid-air and you press the jump button again to attack them. The only difference is that now you can chain up to 6 basic homing attacks together from the get-go, which in levels like Desert Ruins Act 2 feels really satisfying to pull off on the right set of enemies. However, in other cases this isn't as efficient, with the limitation not allowing you to take out an entire set of enemies and only some of them. Don't worry though, once you're done with the homing attack you can still target another enemy afterwards, that much hasn't changed. Although the new system does take a little bit of getting used to, I think it adds a nice bit of flair to the levels every so often. There's also another side to the homing attack now though. You can charge it. This mainly applies in boss fights, but there are certain enemies that work with this too. If you wait to attack an enemy, you can lock up to them up to 3 different times to deal 3 times the damage. So essentially you take the energy you would spend attacking multiple enemies to damage a single enemy a whole lot more. Makes sense. Of course, this does make boss fights extremely short, as we'll get into later, and I think it's certainly an interesting idea that could have had a little bit more polish and thought, especially since most enemies just die in one hit anyway. And while it doesn't seem like we're going to get anything else following up on it since Forces went back to the boost formula, I'd at least like to see them have a stab at it in some point at the future. Sonic also gained the ability to kick an enemy too, which is crucial for hitting certain types either by deflecting their projectiles back at them or to lower their guard. It's certainly a robust homing attack, I'll give them that much, and while I like the idea of the concepts they've got going on, it really was in need of a little bit more refinement to be balanced. Another thing I can get down with are these cloud box things. If you fail a specific section too much, hitting them will send you to the next section, allowing you to hopefully continue. Now, Lost World is bloody difficult at times, so I like the fact that this is here. I'm sure if you've played a Sonic game when you were younger and you always got stuck on that one part, you can kind of relate as to why this is here. Of course, it's optional. By all means, beat the next section on your own merits. Just because you pass it up once doesn't mean it won't be there again the next time. But sometimes there can't be a next time because this game also has a life system like everything that preceded it. Run out of them, you have to go back to the start of the level. Of course, there are capsules around the hub worlds and stages that give you a fair few, and as in previous games, getting 100 rings will net you an extra one too. I just think it's important to mention that after this game, Sega have seemingly ditched the life system starting with Sonic Forces. I mean, if you really wanted to, you could get 99 lives by the end of the second world and trivialise the rest of the game. I mean, I personally enjoy the live inclusions for what it's worth, but I can see why the industry is starting to turn away from them more and more. It offers an incentive to be consistently good at the game and not just exploit the jump ahead feature. And then, there's the wisps. Look, there's no in-plot explanation as to why the fuck they're here, but according to a few sources, they liked the look of Sonic's world back in colours and some decided to stay behind. Okay, they're really just here because Sonic Team saw Cause's success and thought the Wisps were probably the sole key to that and decided to throw them in here as a safe bet. Anyways, returning is Laser, Drill, Rocket and Hover, and the newcomers are Bomb, Rhythm, Eagle and Asteroid. As to not be here all day, Laser is the exact same as it was in Cause, aim at crystals gets a shortcut. Drill is also similar, start drilling into the ground, although now you can do it in 3D. Hover is quite literally used to float and use the Lightspeed dash, and Rocket is used to go from space to space, although now you can aim it using the gamepad if you so wish. Eagle allows you to glide through portions of the level, and Asteroid allows you to destroy parts of it. Bomb turns Sonic into a bomb that can roll over enemies, and last but not least there's Rhythm, which can jump off these music note things to get across gaps. There's variety if nothing else. It's just a shame that besides the old collectible here and there really isn't much to do with them in terms of essential level progression, besides maybe Rocket, Drill and Melody. The rest you could probably go the entire game without even touching or thinking about. It's a bonus for some and a downside for others, I guess. I will say I do like some of the improvements on display here, like aiming Rocket and drilling in 3D were pretty fun, and the new additions such as Melody are pretty fun, albeit a bit finicky. Now my main gripe with these guys is that they're just underutilized or flat out useless. Eagle appears twice, both in parts where he's optional, and the more boring option at that. I didn't even remember Bomb existed until I wrote this review. Hover appears literally in the last few acts as a grand total of twice, and the rest are just pretty much underutilized because they realize forcing you to use them that much would just feel like a rehash of Cause. Now look, I can appreciate the fact that they knew not everyone likes the Wisps, and they haven't chose to force them down your throat that much. But if they've got to be here, at least make them somewhat important to either the plot or more involved with the gameplay, because as it stands right now, a lot of the core powers in this game really feel like an afterthought that they wanted to just slap on the box. And with that said, I think that covers the majority of the gameplay. Of course, your first and primary directive is to go fast, despite what some people might tell you about this one. Levels have a timer that will give you a game over if it hits 0, and while generous, you can't exactly slug through these levels either. Again, combining the multi-homing attack, parkour and wisps perfectly makes these stages flow quite well and fun to run through if you know what you're doing. It certainly needs some refinement, but on the whole I like what they were going for. It's different and it definitely works at parts. Hey, I might even say it manages to stay fresh through the whole thing. But I feel as though Sonic's moveset could have been balanced and adjusted ever so slightly to make for a smoother experience on the whole. And for the Wisps, look, if they had to be here, I guess they could have been a little better. They're more missed opportunities than a hindrance, so I guess that counts as a half positive. Sonic fans are cripplingly afraid of change though, and honestly I think the fact that this game slows it down a little made a lot of people bring out the oh so wonderful complaint that it wasn't Sonic. Personally, I found the gameplay fun and satisfying to get into, and while I think it offers just enough speed to feel fast, it also can feel quite leisurely too. Did it make sense all the way through? Hell no, things could have been handled better, but for what it's worth, I'd say Sonic Team had a solid attempt at this new formula, and I would really like for them to have a second crack at it sometime in the future. Now that you've got a general idea as to how the game sounds, looks and feels, I think it's only fair I go through the different acts of this game like I did with Sonic Unleashed. Starting off we have Windy Hill, which is very much a Green Hill clone, but they at least tried to hide it this time. It's basic and ground that was already treaded multiple times at this point, although it has a few windmills, big springs and bouncy clouds to set itself apart. It's very much an introductory stage, designed to make sure you at least understand most of Sonic's moveset from here on out. 3 of the 4 acts are like this, with Act 2 taking nicely at place with the sunset, and Act 3 being this weird gravity tunnel thing. It's alright, it's enjoyable, and I think it manages to still teach you the basic controls of the game without pulling the Secret Rings tutorial back from hell. Now initially, Desert Ruins looks extremely disappointing, it's just another bland desert level. And for the first act, that's just true, but Act 2 shakes things up and has Sonic running through a literal honeycomb highway similar to 06's max speed sections, which results in one of the best stages in the game. The challenge is there, pulling off combos on those bee things feels satisfying, and there is an alarming amount of hidden lives up for grabs here too. Act 3 also shakes it up and adds an S to the name to take you to Desert Ruins. While aesthetically interesting and a novel idea, it's relatively short and is more so just nice to look at than actually play. Still, it's a fun time and certainly helps to break up the desert aesthetic, and I'll take that any day of the week. Finally, there's Act 4, which is mostly an auto-scroller, which is about as enjoyable as an auto-scroller can be. You're chased by this clearly very rubber bandy Sandnado, and while more competent than Act 3, still leaves a lot to be desired. Except for the addition of the previous boss arena being in the background of the new boss arena, that's a nice touch. In essence, Desert Ruins has one really good act, 2 okay acts, and 1 level that's so middle of the road it hurts. Tropical Coast is where things really start to pick up though, with a lot more unique mechanics to keep itself from feeling stale. Whether that be collecting butterflies scattered on platforms to open the way forward, rolling a pineapple into enemies, or being chased by a large apple or watermelon to lead it into a juicer, which allows you to then use the ensuing juice stream to advance to the next area? This zone has quite a different design philosophy than the rest of the game, opting for plenty of basic but fun puzzles and levels that feel a lot more open. But that's not all. Act 3 is a rail grinding level, and while I discussed the shortcomings that these have over in the gameplay section, it's hard not to agree this is still a really fun stage with a lot of incentive to master. It looks really unique. The addition of fast and slow rails is something that I feel is utilised well, and the fact it doesn't pull too many punches makes it a favourite regardless of a few janky controls. If I had to give this zone a rank, it'd be an S. Then there's Frozen Factory. If there's one complaint I have, it's that Act 1 of this zone is really boring and just feels like a frozen windy hill. Luckily, Act 2 is nice and distinct, being an act where you spend the entire level as a snowball, Crash Bandicoot style, and my god, this is some of the best and most challenging content in the game hands down. Some might call this gimmicky, but personally I found a change in mechanics to be something refreshing so long as it's not overdone, especially when you go asininely fast in this level if you take the time to master it. After that, you end up visiting this really appealing casino level, which is sadly just more looks than actual gameplay. I mean, it has a pinball segment and a nice aesthetic, it just feels quite shallow. It's better than Desert Ruins at the very least. Act 4, much like Act 1, just feels a little bit too close to Windy Hill, although I do feel it's a bit more unique and on the whole it's just a little more fun to play. Really, the only gripe here is that there's a pretty bad automated section towards the end which can easily get you killed. Following that is Silent Forest, that is a vast improvement over the previous zone. It feels fresh and distinct in its design, with more than enough capsules dotted around for you to find. There's nice emphasis on the kick move here to take down stronger enemies, and Act 1 is one of the strongest levels in the game, balancing a good mix of fast and slow moments perfectly. There's a wonderful level in the form of Act 2 which is entirely 2D, and I promise that doesn't always have to be an omen. It has you evading the spotlight on this big owl thing. If you get caught, you're killed and sent back to the last checkpoint. It's just one of those only levels that takes place at night, and just, my god does it look gorgeous. It's so bloody distinct, and once again is a great level all around. And Act 3? This is unedited footage, it's another version of the Gravity Tunnel level, just harder, only it looks like it belongs in the previous zone. Like, why is it all frozen? We're in a tropical jungle. Like, functionally it's fine, it's just a little confusing as to why it's here. Act 4 manages to pick up the slack though with a cool lighting mechanic and some pretty challenging obstacles, although once again it is an entirely 2D stage for the worse this time. Next is Sky Road, which is the worst zone in the game. Act 1 is just a difficult windy hill with not much else to it, and I'd say it's actually one of the worst levels in the game. Following that is Act 2, which is 2D right up until the boss fight. It has a cool unique atmosphere composed of these stylized platforms, more clouds and these dragon guys. It's also concerningly challenging, although considering this is the second to last zone in the game, I can kind of welcome it. Act 3 is essentially Sonic Flappy Bird and is once again one of the worst stages in the game, lacking any form of substance in the slightest. And then there's Act 4, which looks like a Desert Ruins level with a few extra thunder clouds. It's average. It's really average. Yeah, this is also like, I don't use this lightly, but the most dull and clearly just rehashed zone in the game. You can tell where they took most of the assets from, and well, normally that wouldn't be too much of a problem. It just doesn't seem too cohesive. Act 2 is the only one that really feels like it's a sky road. The Act 1 you could argue at points it is, it just really falls flat. It is, by and large, the worst zone in the game. Like, I get eventually you're gonna have to reuse things in the game, like, you could have just had a rainy, windy hill, 2 levels in the clouds with one of them being thunderclouds. The entire concept just feels rushed, and I feel that this is most likely the last zone they developed for the game because the entire thing is really underwhelming. In fact, I'd go as far to say that it solely exists just to contain Zavok's boss fight before the final zone. Speaking of which, we arrive at Lava Mountain. And while way less assets are reused here, with each act feeling like you're actually at a volcano, Act 1 is entirely a boss rush against the first 3 Zeta you meet. Act 3 is also mainly bosses with very little in the way of actual level content. Act 4 is the final boss, leaving us with about 1.3 acts to actually discuss. Did I mention Act 2 was the rail grinding level again? Now, credit where it's due, the level does feel like a nice endgame challenge, and I unironically think it's the best out of the zone. It fits quite nicely too, probably being in a hot spring this time instead. The difficulty is jacked up 25 times here though, and you'll probably die more in this zone than you did in the rest of the entire game until this point. Very much love or hate it zone, with plenty of room to master again. My only complaint is that these bomb carts that will just insta-kill you on contact have the world's worst hitbox known to man, making them a complete nuisance. Regardless, that brings us to Act 3, and the part that isn't bosses, the 3D sections feel like a good test of these skills up until this point, and it can be pretty unforgiving. I mean, you're meant to use parkour at certain points too, and it sometimes just likes to not work, so it's not the best. And then that brings us to 2D sections, which are less awful. I like the idea that you have to like run up these walls and wall jump, but you need to time it at the perfect time to avoid obstacles moving along them. I like that as a concept. It's just, once again, the system isn't refined to the point where I would argue it's great. And then there's bosses, which we'll cover in the next section. Essentially, Lava Mountain, again, it feels rushed, but even more so than the last act. The only reason it even gets points above the last act is because it had another rail grinding level that was actually kinda neat. It's strange trying to talk about Lost World levels. There are some really standout levels and zones, with a mix of average to okay ones, but also far too many which beg the question as to what the hell Sonic team were thinking here. It seems as though the first 3 zones were designed without a hitch. Frozen Factory and Silent Jungle had a few, and then Sky Road and Lava Mountain just fell apart. And I honestly wish I could guess why this was. They had something going, but whether it was laziness or time constraints, it's obvious the quality of the levels in this game decrease as they go along, especially in the last 2 zones. Still, with that said, don't let it diminish what I said about the rest of the game, which is all, besides maybe the odd stage and design decision, good. It's actually really, really good. There were some really fun, unique mechanics at play here that have their teething issues for sure, but for a solid 5/7 of the game, the levels are all solid. It's just a shame that the majority of the failures are bundled up in one place, and I think that can lead to some unfair judgment on some fronts. Lost World certainly has troubles in this department, and almost certainly suffered from time constraints towards the end, but I still think it has plenty of good and fun levels to play. And yes, at times that can include the last 2 zones as well. Now, as a minor aside, I need to talk about this. Anytime you defeat an enemy or open one of these capsules, you'll get the Flickies inside. They're added to an overall counter, and Act 4 for each area requires you to have a set amount of them. Now, normally you'll only be a few short, something that 5 to 6 minutes of effort can fix with no problem. Hell, just take a trip to the circus area if you're lucky. But they also serve as a little incentive to go and explore some of the stages too. You could have to backtrack more if you just go from A to B, but think outside the box and you're usually rewarded with a mini container of 5. To be fair, I find this game unbelievably fun, so this could just be me, but I honestly don't mind their inclusion. If anything, it gives me an excuse to go back and replay acts I liked and grab a few extra red rings here and there. I know this is probably unintentional, but if you actually complain about these guys gatekeeping progress, you're definitely playing the game wrong. If you need an extra few, it's not a major hassle given you pick literally any level that isn't solely rail grinding. But that's the thing. Their inclusion is so non-invasive it begs the question as to why they're in here at all. I like the concept, and while this is coming from someone who likes the medals in Sonic Unleashed, using them to gatekeep progress is just stupid. Making them for cosmetics or something? Hell, extra acts would be nice milestones to aim for, but being an obstacle in main game progression? and not even being that much of an obstacle to begin with, it just begs the question as to why they're here at all. That aside, it's time to talk about the bosses. Each zone in the game has 2 of them, with them appearing at the end of their respective stage, one at Act 2 and one at Act 4, with a different Zeti for each zone. Now, for what it's worth, each boss manages to have its own unique gimmick, and when you consider that there are 15 in the game, it's impressive how many of these actually work well. Minor problem though, they're all over in seconds. How? Well, each boss takes 6 hits to defeat, and if the existence of the charged homing attack is anything to go by, they're basically all over in 2 hits or less. Which is a shame, because if you actually take these battles slowly, these guys actually have more than a few tricks up their sleeves to making things a little bit harder. However, 9 out of 10 times that's not going to happen, and it'll be over. In fact, I reckon I'll spend more time talking about the bosses than it did for me to actually beat all of them. So with that challenge set, both Zaz's fights are laughably easy, comprising of hitting him off this yellow ball and dodging him when he charges. He can also fire stars out from the ball, just throw the thing so that you need to dodge, but mainly he can just be attacked whenever he's on the ground. It's easy, but it's somehow fun. Zoomon first fights you on this big Mayan face thing, and he'll slam himself into the side of it to make it spin, meaning you have to fly onto the other side and attack him while he's recovering. In between attacks you also have to skydive onto the face as it falls, dodging spike balls that it'll fire at you. The next time you meet him you'll have to dodge him while he bounces around the arena and does this tornado attack. There's a segment where you need to use drills to chase him and have to run up the sides of the arena in order to dodge his attacks. If it's any surprise, while easy, these boss fights are still pretty epic. 6 boss fights are, interesting. If you remember that fruit mechanic I mentioned, you kind of just bully him with it. Yeah, he'll chase you around on an apple and you have to lure him into the blender before you can attack him. And this second boss fight really isn't much else either. Yeah, you could say that these fights are underwhelming. I think the first one is pretty funny, all things considered, but they're okay. I like to think that the extra content in Tropical Coast more than makes up for the fact that the boss kind of has a few shortcomings. Follow that up with Xena, who probably has the most memorable boss fight in the game for the wrong reasons. This happens in that snowball level I was on about before, and they'll hide in a snowman and you have to knock down the one they're hiding in by perfectly aligning your homing attack to knock down as many snowmen as possible, and then spin dash into them. If that sounds difficult because you need to get correct angles, plus the slip and slide mechanics of being on the snow, you're correct. The second time you fight her, she just has a ball and it's practically over in 5 seconds without any real invincibility frames for her to even get the fight started. Following up with that is Zor, whose first fight is in one of my favourite levels of the game. You have to kick his projectiles back at him and then attack him, and lots over quickly I can appreciate the utilisation of the kick mechanic here. It's something that unless you know to use or are too familiar with, this will stump you for a short while. And then his second boss fight, I can't actually give an in on because I don't understand what the mechanic is. I'm pretty sure he's getting carried around by bats, and you have to pull the light switch and then the bats dissipate and he dies in like 10 seconds. I can't give you a good enough description of this boss fight because I can't actually understand the mechanics behind it, so it's, interesting to say the least. And then there's Zavok. His first boss fight is actually one of the best ones in the game because you can't kill him in a few seconds. He'll charge around on the snake thing, of which you then need to attack the tail when it stops and work your way up before homing attack into him. Rinse and repeat, you're fine and dandy. Then his second boss fight is also one of those that'll stump you. You fight him on this long bridge thing and you need to essentially like trick him and break his guards when he's at the end of the snake to knock him into the lava. It's, again, a lot of these boss fights are really confusing and I'm not sure how the best way to describe them is. Just watch a tutorial, because honestly I had to look one up. This boss fight is very confusing. You have to charge up the thing 6 times, even though on a single target the limit is 3, and there's no indication beforehand that that's what you need to do. Yeah. The last 2 Zeddy boss fights are essentially boss rushes, and are as much of a cakewalk as you'd expect, with only really Zavok posing any real threat in these. They're short, sweet, and this time they're meant to be, although for villains that were prominent throughout the whole game, seeing them go down in such an underwhelming way is kind of disappointing. Minus maybe Zavok, who actually gets some time to shine, and Zor, who literally drops a line about Death's cold embrace. They do feel a little bit past-paced, even by this game's standards. Then there's the final boss with Dr. Eggman, which is also underwhelming, very much being a rehash of the Sonic Core's final boss, and soon to be Sonic Force's final boss as well. Like, you're telling me they had time to almost make every other boss fight in the game unique, but when it comes to Eggman they couldn't think of anything? Again, the last portion of this game just feels rushed, and I really don't know why. They weren't rushing to make it a launch title or in time for the holidays, they certainly weren't down that bad. So the only thing I can see them pressuring was their deal with Nintendo, maybe? Maybe part of that deal was that the game needed to be out by the end of 2013, and making additional content would have run into the new year? Just a thought. Still, the bosses in this game are good in concept, mostly, but bad in execution by and large. I'm aware how unlikely it's going to be that this game's going to get a remaster or port anytime this century, but it feels as though if they do, there can be some serious tweaks made to these boss fights to make them feel like much more of a worthwhile inclusion. Lost World has a concerning amount of things to do and download. Starting out with the DLC, there were 3, the Knights DLC being available on all platforms as a Sega IP, and the Zelda and Yoshi DLC being Wii U exclusives because they're Nintendo's, which I don't have access to since my copy broke. So I did the thing all Persona fans do, and if I don't have access to a game, I'm going to watch somebody else play it and form my opinion based on that. The Yoshi's Island world is much more of a fun distraction than anything else, with Sonic's main objective to hit these blocks to get Yoshi eggs that follow him for the rest of the short level. Once he reaches the end, every egg he collects gives him one extra life, the zone disappears until 100,000 more points have been scored on regular levels, and life goes on. The set dressing is all done really well, with a small selection of iconic Mario enemies also making an appearance, the level looking extremely similar to the actual game, and a nice remix from Tomohiro Otani to go along with it. Next up is the Zelda level, which opens with this banging open world segment and a great main theme remix to boot. You can find rupees, open hidden passages, followed by the iconic sound that accompanies just that, attack chickens, ride that bird from Skyward Sword. It's pretty nice, especially being the only thing of its kind in the whole game. You want to know what's better? Sonic is dressed up as Link. I mean, just look at how that hat works, okay? Fair play, Sega, fair play. After that, another one of those tunnel segments, just with Zelda aesthetics. Link also makes an appearance here, and before long the level is over and Sonic manages to nab the Triforce. Now onto the non-exclusive DLC is Nightmare Zone, which ironically is the best DLC by far. I know nothing about Knights, so please forgive me. It starts with Sonic falling asleep and dreaming about running through Windy Hill, but his dream gets hijacked, I think. And then he's made to go through a boss rush of each of the Deadly Six. It's nothing new and mechanically is all recycled, but everything in these boss rush segments is Knights themed, which I can absolutely dig. The bosses themselves are actually easier than their main game counterparts, although the lack of rings made it much easier to die here, kind of acting as a sort of balance. It ends with Sonic waking up from the nightmare end stage, which is a shame because all the music tracks in this level absolutely slap. The DLC certainly isn't a deal breaker, however I'd be saying that the grand admission fee of free, you really can't complain. It's a nice distraction and is certainly to make fans of the series as featured a little happy. I think the Zelda DLC was actually modded into the PC release earlier this year too, so even if you can't track down the Wii U copy, you can at least give it a try. There are also a few extra acts. I haven't been able to find all of them, and God knows I'm not sitting through all of them, but they're essentially just rehashed versions of other acts. The main one I played was Tropical Coasts, which was a reused version of Sky Road Zone 3. I already didn't find that zone particularly appealing because it was just inverse Flappy Bird, but hey, if you're looking for more content, it's there. That segues into the bonus world, which you unlock after you complete Lava Mountain, and for what it's worth, I completely detest its existence. Honestly, I would have very much rather preferred them to have completely scrapped this and never made it, and focused the development time they spent on that on improving the, actually somewhat good parts of the game into being better. It's bad. It's 4 acts of like the most dull, bland, boring, gimmicky, bad stuff imaginable. I had no fun recording it. It was just a slog. It felt like I had to complete it out of obligation for the Let's Play more so than I wanted to. The OST also is just, it's mind-numbing. Tomohiro Otani, I'm not sure what you were doing, but this is not pleasant music. The entire zone is not pleasant, and for as much as I will rag on the latter zones in the game for having a drop-off in quality, to put it into comparison, if the other zones had a little bit of a trip in their quality towards the end, this zone is the equivalent to driving straight into the Grand Canyon. And that's it. Despite the fact this game clearly had something behind the scenes working against it, I still like Sonic Lost World. It's fun at points, and I feel that while the direction it took was certainly questionable, feeling much more like an adventure game in terms of speed, I still think it's a solid platformer. The music absolutely slaps, the levels look amazing from a design and technical standpoint, the gameplay could certainly use some refining, but is ultimately fine, much of the bosses are the same although they're a bit too short, and the inclusion of Flickies, while not intrusive, is still a little strange to see return after Unleashed's reception. What I think sets Lost World apart is the fact it feels much more like a return to what Sonic was in his early 3D games. Not blazingly fast or easy, not too slow, and certainly not boring. It's a streamlined experience which I think makes it much more accessible to just pick up and play than Adventure or Heroes, and that is a strength. It's definitely a little bit of a different direction to see, more momentum-y based and whatnot, but for what it's worth, I think it's cool, and a good way to get a few new people hooked on the wider series as a whole. Just maybe shelve the story and you might be able to bump up the score a bit. It's no Unleashed, but I'll take this game any day of the week over for cause. It may not seem a little high to some people, but I think it's deserving of a 7 and nothing less. Flawed at points, but enjoyable at so many more. Do I think we're ever going to see a sequel with the return of this gameplay style? No. I mean, at no point is the game inherently bad, but this clearly isn't what most people are looking for in a Sonic game, even if I could find enjoyment here. But then again, maybe the fact this was just a one and done endeavour is what makes this thing all feel all the more special. I would like to see something done like a Lost World Plus, which fleshes out the last 2 worlds and sands down the rough edges, but with the minimal fan base this game seems to have, I don't think that's going to happen anytime at all. And with that said, I think we're done. This one turned out a lot shorter than anticipated, but to be fair, Lost World is a much smaller game than Persona 3 was, and no matter how much I wanted to drag this out, there wasn't anything to really drag out beyond the point that we're at now. So hopefully you've enjoyed regardless. Stay tuned to the channel for the next week or so to find out what the next review is, and I think with that said, that's going to be everything. So until next time, with all said, all that aside, my name's been Ramic, thank you for watching, and peace out.